Welcome everybody to today's presentation on the area of communication and language development. This is the fourth area of development that we'll have discussed. Some of these slides will look very familiar because we've looked at them before, but I will try to get through it all as quickly as possible so that there's time for questions at the end. So to start with, this space is an affirming space, and I want to make sure that today, particularly when we're discussing language and communication, that I'm capturing that element of it. We use affirming language here. It's an affirming environment, which means that we use identity-first language. This is based on the social model of disability, which centers lived experience over medical or deficit framing. And we also use identity-first language to center our identity instead of pathology in terms of neurodivergence. So it's important for understanding that neurodivergence is a difference, not a disorder. And that is the framing for everything that for the way I will be speaking throughout the presentation. Neurodevelopment is the way that the brain's development happens with its system and networks to allow us to read, think, memorize, attention, or direct attention, and so on. Neurotype is the different ways that a brain can be wired to do that. Neurotypical is the predominant neurotype, or also known as neuronormative, and that is the way that society is set up to support us already. So if you're a neurotypical person, then society is set up to meet your needs. A neurodivergent person is a person whose brain has developed and functions in a way that is different to the way society and culture is set up. So that you can see there from the neurodivergent umbrella, that includes a lot of things, because those are all different ways of processing and interacting with the world. And neurodiversity is a group of people who have different neurotypes. So neurodiversity does not equal neurodivergent. Those are two different things. Very quickly, the cupcake example. Vanilla cupcakes are neurotypical. All the other cupcakes are neurodivergent. If we have a mix of cupcakes, then we have neurodiversity. If we only have one group of cupcakes, whether that's neurotypical cupcakes or autistic cupcakes or FASD cupcakes, if that group is homogeneous, if there's not a mix of types, then it's not neurodiversity. It may well be neurodivergent, but it isn't neurodiverse. The 6 areas of development that are captured within the profile wheel are cognitive, sensory, emotional, communication, motor, and social. And as everyone will know by now, each of those areas kind of breaks down a little bit further. It's not like a single category. There's a lot of complex information in there, which is why we're doing these deep dive sessions to try to give a better working understanding of each of these areas of development so that you can better utilize the profile wheel. The recording of the session that I did in November with Lori Morrison, who's an ed psych with the Highland Council on the Neurodevelopmental Profile Wheel and how it's supposed to function. That's the link there for it. It's also on the playlist that I'll be sending you the link to after today's session. So the profile wheel, what does it look like? It looks like that, which is basically just the areas of development in a circle, because they're all equally important pieces of this picture that makes up a person's brain, that makes up their neurotype. When we're talking about specifically, when we're suspecting that there may be a neurodivergence or a neurodevelopmental difference, what we're using this tool for is to understand what's happening underneath the observable evidence, that external behavior, because we can very easily see what somebody is doing, but it doesn't mean we understand why they're doing it. And that's why we have the tool, is to help us understand that. The 6 areas of development that make up a person's internal experience are the same areas that are assessed in an NDOS assessment, but then the profile wheel is not a part of the NDOS process. That process is a singular diagnostic tool. This is an iterative support tool where we're going to keep coming back to it over and over. So at the center of that wheel of the areas of development is the My World Triangle, because we need to remember that we're looking at the strengths and challenges in all parts of a child's life. And we need to remember that this is a tool that we're using for that child. It is that child's profile. And so we're trying to understand their experience in all areas of their life. And it's a team activity. This isn't something that schools or parents should be doing in isolation from each other. It needs to be a conversation so that everybody understands that it has the same picture of that child's needs, so that there's everybody's on the same page. And again, children and their families must be fully included in discussions like this, so that the child's view can be captured in whatever way is appropriate for that child. We're capturing the examples of behavior, of the observable behavior, so that we can then go away and ask questions about what internal experience is driving that behavior. That's why we're doing this. So, language and communication development. This is the process of acquiring language and the understanding of how to use it. It includes receptive and expressive language, and that includes verbal, visual, and vocal language. So receptive language in terms of what we were talking about with cognitive, with how we're processing inputs, cognitive and sensory. This is input, so receptive is input, and expressive language is how you feed back out, so that's our output, that's our response. Communication allows us to share our experiences, express needs, imagine, make up ideas for what we want to do for our lives, to empathize, to build relationships, influence others, and understand others. And so communication is fairly significant. What makes up this process? Well, there was a man named Dr. Albert Mehrabian, who was a psychologist, who published research in the 1960s that led to this theory of verbal and nonverbal communication. So the words that can be spoken and all the other parts of communication that aren't words. And his formula says that 55% of communication is visual. It's our body language, our posture, our facial expression, eye contact. 38% of it is vocal. It's the sound of our voice, the pitch of our voice, the intonation, the rhythm, the pace, all of those things. So how we're using our voice. And only 7% of it is the words itself, the vocabulary, the content of it. So the conclusion here is that 93% of communication comes down to nonverbal expression. So things that have nothing to do with the words that we're saying. But what's often missed out of when people are discussing this model is that he was speaking specifically about communications of feelings and attitudes, so feelings of like and dislike, and particularly when it's an ambiguous situation, when the facial expression, for example, doesn't match the tone of voice. So it's not applicable to all forms of communication or in all situations, but it gets used a lot like it is. So it's problematic for that reason, because it's limited in its scope and people don't realize the limit in its scope, but also because it is speaking only about the way neurotypical brains communicate. So it's neuronormative. It is in no way considering that neurodivergent people communicate in a very different way. So these percentages do not reflect in any way whatsoever neurodivergent communication norms. However, I mention it because it's still useful to know, number one, that this is what neurotypical people, this is how they're communicating. So that's good to know, because it's always good to have a cheat sheet, right? Like this is what they're looking for. But also because then as people who are supporting young people, we can say, this is what is different for you. You don't have to change. And the way you're doing it is perfectly fine. We're just going to make you aware that this is what this person might think, because that's why there might be some confusion here. And also, we're going to talk to those neurotypical people and tell them too that there are other ways to communicate. So we have to be aware of that difference in order to be able to address it and to change it. the graphics are just showing you some examples of nonverbal communication. I think the important one here that I really wanted to point out was that under body language, it has eye contact and blink rate. And particularly for me, the reason I wanted to mention this is because I know that it has been used as an example by police officers in arresting autistic people because they're shifty, because they won't make eye contact. They're being suspicious, right? They won't make eye contact. Their eyes are blinking a lot. And so in terms of changing the world, which is always my grander ambition, we need to be aware that that behavior that is just autistic behavior, just normal autistic communication behavior, that it can be kind of weaponized or misunderstood to the point of catastrophe. So we have to be able to address that as early as possible with other people to try to change that pathway, to say, and also I've talked a lot about informing young people about what their differences are so that they can find their voice and they can express themselves and they can advocate for themselves. And this is part of that, is protecting them long term. Okay, so this is a little bit of an activity, and I'm gonna give you just a minute to grab a piece of paper and a pen or pencil, scrap paper. Nobody needs to see your work, so you don't need to be worried about your paper looking super pretty. But it's just a very quick thing to demonstrate what happens when we communicate without a lot of explicit direction. Okay, so we're gonna draw a line. Now I want you to draw 2 more lines. Okay, now draw a circle. Draw 2 more circles. And finally, draw a curved line. So hopefully everybody has a little bit of a drawing there. I'm going to show you what mine looks like. Does mine match yours? I'm going to guess not. But you can put in the chat if it looks anything like that. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the next part. We're going to try it again. And this time I'm going to use better language. So I want you to go 1/3 of the way down the paper. So flip your paper over. I'm going to go 1/3 of the way down the page and draw a horizontal line. Draw 2 more lines to make it into a triangle like this. If I can make my thumb straight there. Draw a circle underneath the triangle as wide as the line is long. So you've got the line and then, circle. Inside this circle, draw 2 smaller circles for eyes. Also inside the bigger circle, draw a curved line for a smile. Okay, so that's my drawing this time. Give me a thumbs up if your drawing matched or was somewhat similar. Yeah, there we go. There's our thumbs up. So now we're going to reflect on that activity. And also, in case you didn't know, that was supposed to be a clown. Okay, so I want you to use the chat box to answer these questions, and I won't read them out now. I'm going to read them out during the question and answer session, but I want you to think about it. So I want you to put it somewhere. How did you feel during activity A? Did that feel really easy, or were you feeling kind of, my favorite word in the entire world, discombobulated? What felt different during activity B? And what do you think could have made it all easier? I've done this before and I still couldn't remember how to do it. Right? Like, I totally have done it before too. And when I I was watching a video, the previous video to prepare to do this. I had completely forgotten also that this is what I was supposed to be doing. Yeah, activity B, it all fell into place. Absolutely. Because hopefully what you'll have gotten from this is that it matters how we talk about things, right? It matters that I'm going to go back. It went ahead. It, the confused a little, but understood better the second time. Yeah. So we've got experience of having done it already, maybe putting things a little bit more in order. I was using visuals as well as my voice, and I went a little bit slower and I emphasized certain things a little bit differently. So I was using that vocal part, I was using the visual part, and then I had the verbal part. And I made sure to give a little bit more clarity in my directions so that it wasn't just so haphazard. This is obviously important to understand for this is for how we communicate with others, but also to understand how others are communicating with us. Ooh, Trina, like the freedom of activity A, very nice. Also demonstrating that just because you're clear with directions doesn't mean that that's going to make somebody happy, right? Maybe that just isn't the way their brain works. So we have to be adapting to work with each other. Thank you for that, Trina. That was brilliant. Okay, so this is the science a little bit. I just want to give you a basis of this so that we can then talk about comparisons. So the 6 stages of language development, there's analytic language processing, which is the neurotypical pathway of language development. So each stage builds on the previous one. This starts with babbling, works its way up to 1 word, 2 word, into sentences, and so on. And in brief, this can be referred to as parts to whole. So we learn the little bits, we add them up like bricks, like Lego bricks, and we end up with the ability to have some structure. There's also Gestalt or Gestalt. I always say that wrong. Gestalt language processing. Gestalt language processing refers to learning language by acquiring chunks of language, like phrases or sentences, as wholes. And those chunks are called gestalts. So as you progress through this language processing, the gestalts are gradually broken down into words. So you learn the whole phrase, then you start to understand the individual words within it. You break it down and learn the single words, and then put it all back together into complete sentences with grammar, which is what those little bricks are demonstrating there. So, oh, Jan, if you can just put your mute on, please. Thank you. So for neurodivergent people, this is very commonly how they process language as Gestalt language processors, which is why you see that alternate timeline or development pathway in terms of language milestones that they reach. So both neurotypical and neurodivergent children can be Gestalt language processors. It's not like, well, they do it this way, they can't be autistic, or they do it this way, they can't be neurotypical. But usually it's discussed as a part of neurodivergent communication development because it's just more obvious, I guess. So we're thinking whole to part thinkers, that we're thinking entirely differently about how language functions. And therefore, learning activities and things like that in school make much less sense when you're starting with a, ba, ka, because those aren't even really the names of the letters, are they? Right? So we introduce a kind of a layer of challenge when our young people are wanting to learn by chunks. It's also usually discussed in relation to autistic people who use echolalia. And if you don't know what echolalia is, we can talk about that during question time. But basically, it's repeating whole phrases, and those phrases have previously been considered to be kind of meaningless, like they can't figure out what to say, so they repeat other stuff. But through Gestalt language processing, we can understand that those phrases have significant value and it's meaningful language. All aspects, all ways of processing language are equally valid. There's no one way that's better than the other. So in communication styles and differences, I always think about it this way, that neurodivergent people communicating with neurotypical people is like two different operating systems on computers trying to talk to each other. It's frustrating and ineffective because you don't have the same programming. And so that's where we have kind of a lot of that friction where neurodivergent young people are considered to be rude for their tone or whatever, when really they're asking questions because they really desperately want to understand. And and this friction comes it derives from the fact that social norms for communication are based in neurotypical communication norms, not in neurodivergent ones. So because of that, there's a frequent misunderstanding that always ends up getting put on the neurodivergent person as how they are failing to communicate effectively. However, we know through lots of work that's been done that it actually goes both ways, right? And this is referred to as the double empathy problem. Neurodivergent people are speaking their language. And I just for that, I want to note for that graphic, it says autistic and ADHD under there, but that is not the only neurodivergent groups. It's just, a single graphic. So don't think that's all we're talking about here. Um, Neurotypical people have certain expectations, neurodivergent people have certain expectations, and when neurodivergent people are speaking with neurodivergent people, usually goes pretty well. When neurotypical people are speaking with neurotypicals, usually goes pretty well. The difficulty comes when we're trying to do those two different kinds of programming. And so we have to be aware of the differences in body language, and it says there's synchronous and asynchronous, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, language, and what is right for somebody might not be right for somebody else, right? We all have to be aware of that. That's double empathy. So, as I said, neurodivergent people are always expected to adapt because societal norms support neurotypical communication styles. But conversations are a two-way responsibility. We have to listen to each other to work to meet each other's needs and our own needs, and feel empowered to say, the way that I'm communicating is because of this. I feel like there's a difficulty going on here because of the way that you're communicating and I'm communicating. Oh, okay. So what behavior might we observe related to communication? This could be info dumping, right? So that's a love language of many a neurodivergent person, sharing everything they know about a particular topic and following people when they try to leave to keep talking about it. I've certainly seen that with my own children. Um, Becoming distressed when directly asked for a response during conversations, seeming to ignore instructions, having difficulty communicating with peers or seeming to understand like what peers are talking about, confusion when others use sarcasm or metaphorical language, frequent awkward interactions with small talk in social situations, becoming frustrated or angry out of nowhere, shy about asking for help, asking lots of questions, wanting to use texting instead of speaking to communicate, withdrawing from activities, becoming situationally non-speaking in certain situations, appearing to be unsure of what is expected of you, not knowing how to stand in line, for example, or be good, responding to a question several hours after it's been asked, um, spending longer or shorter than expected amounts of times responding to instruction. So you've been given the instruction and somebody seems to be sitting there for a really long time, or they seem to have barely listened and they're getting started on it. Again, echolalia, the repetition of sounds, words, and phrases to express oneself, frequent quoting of favorite shows or stories. And let me tell you, in my house, there's a whole lot of quoting of stories and movies. It's how we speak to each other. And so we all kind of know each other's references. And so it's almost like a secret language. Perceived rudeness in communication and preferring to use gestures rather than verbalizing, and speaking very loudly or softly. So what internal experiences could be driving this? Well, so we've already talked about Gestalt language versus analytical language processing. So if you're a Gestalt language processor, tasks at school that are kind of all oriented around analytic language processing learning, they're not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. You're going to struggle with that. It's going to cause frustration, especially when you have the expectations, or there are expectations upon you to be able to complete that task in a certain time frame and whatever. Demands of using that the demands of using metaphorical and flowery language, what I call fluff, the drain that puts on cognitive, emotional, and sensory systems, it can leave you exhausted and deplete your capacity for anything else. Um, there can be a need for asynchronous communication, and that's messages being sent without expecting an immediate response, because synchronous communication, real-time communication, is rapid and overwhelming. And if we remember back to when I was discussing cognitive function back in week one, you'll remember that neurodivergent brains often require much more time for processing because they're processing a lot more information. So they're not going to, if you put somebody on a spot and ask them to answer a question or to come up with a solution for something in the moment, they're not going to be able to do that because their brain is more likely to become paralyzed by the amygdala being activated, being triggered by that fight, flight, freeze response, and shutting down their prefrontal cortex. They need to be able to have the time to go away, work their way through all of the information, and then come back with a response. So asynchronous communication is a beautiful, beautiful thing for a lot of neurodivergent people. I can say specifically when I've got my first email account, um, this is dating me a little bit, when I left high school in 1994, and I got my first email account, I can remember saying to my mother, it's like this whole email thing was invented for me, because I had always found in the moment synchronous communication very overwhelming, and it allowed me to send the information that I needed to and to have time to think about a response before I sent it. Like it felt like email was created for me. I marvel at it every day at how wonderful it is. It's the same thing with text messaging. It's just brilliant, isn't it? Anyway, perceived lack of purpose and value versus the energy it takes to make small talk. So there's not a lot of value in small talk for neurodivergent people. You want to talk about the planets and the solar system and anything deep and meaningful, I'm there for it, but I really can't understand why you care about the weather that much or stuff like that. Like, let's talk about real stuff. Because the energy is that I have to put into that is so much. Excitement at sharing something you really love with someone. So you could get loud and do that info dumping. Lack of clarity and communication input received. So like we were in the first activity, in activity A, there was a lack of clarity in the communication, right? So I was just saying, so draw some random lines. But in terms of the way we speak, idioms, hyperbole, expressions, non-literal language, all of those things are very much the same. There's a lack of clarity in that, and that can be a stumbling block. Sensory integration differences that result in differing nonverbal communication cues. So, for example, the eye contact. So if somebody's trying to make eye contact with me, I'm not thinking about anything but the fact that they're making eye contact with me. I'm not hearing anything they're saying, and I'm not going to be able to respond. So we have to be aware of that. If we need to have an important conversation, is eye contact the most important thing here? And then rejection sensitivity or rejection sensitive dysphoria, which I'm going to talk more about. Those graphics are just showing some of the kind of the differences that, or the things that can be difficult for an internal experience. So to speak about rejection sensitive dysphoria and rejection sensitivity, these two things appear to be more common in neurodivergent people due to the differences in our brain structure and therefore in our emotional regulation. So it is when the cumulative past experience of rejection and failure in all situations kind of stays with you all of the time. And it leads to any perceived rejection or failure in triggering that survival response, the amygdala getting activated, which shuts down the prefrontal cortex, making logical and emotionally regulated communication impossible. So it can lead to, that lack of inhibition. So you can see people become very defensive, angry, almost kind of aggressive in their response because they are in fight, flight, freeze. That's literally what they're in, is fight, flight, freeze. Or they could shut down entirely, right? So it's all of those aspects, whichever one that their body tends to do. People with rejection sensitivity and RSD experience intense emotional responses to rejection, criticism, disapproval, or failure. And that is even just perceived rejection or failure or criticism. And more than that, eventually we start to expect that we will be met with rejection, criticism, and failure. We begin to expect that we will always fail, that we will never meet expectations, and that can make us really defensive and kind of aggressive when we perceive that somebody is criticizing us again. It's classified as dysphoria specifically when that response includes overwhelming emotional pain. So it isn't just the amygdala coming up and the fight, flight, freeze response. It's also like physically hurting you and emotionally hurting you. And this is something that unfortunately very many young people who are neurodivergent end up experiencing very early in life because of all of the societal expectations that are set up for neurotypical people that they constantly fail to meet because they're not neurotypical, so they're never going to. Okay, so how can we help? Well, as always, first we ask the young person what they want and what they need. And then we proceed with the neurodiversity affirming practice. Always listening to the neurodivergent voices, to be informed by them, to tailor support to individual needs, to honor neurodivergent culture, promote autonomy and confidence and self-advocacy, and respect all communication styles. When we support young people in their communication development, we are not telling them how or what to communicate. We have to remove neurotypical communication expectations from them to support them to learn how to express themselves in a way that is right for them. So we're not telling them, don't do it that way, do it this way. We're going to say, here are the facts of the situation. Neurotypical people interact this way. I've noticed that you interact this way. Maybe be aware of how somebody else is going to be reacting to you so that it's not that they're criticizing you. They just think differently. They just work differently, right? We have to be kind of explicit in this messaging that we're doing. We want to be strength focused rather than deficit correcting. Ensure that there are trusted adults around the young person who are attuned to their individual needs, provide that consistent approach in all areas of the child's world, and always validate their internal experience. This NeuroWild graphic that I have here, this is social communication goals for neurotypical people. So if you have anybody who is saying to you that your young person is a poor communicator, you can share this one with them, just whip that on over to them to let them know that social communication goals go both ways. Specific support strategies. We, as much as possible, should use literal direct language and be as clear and ordered in our instructions as possible, just like the difference between activity and activity B. If we feel that there's something really important that a young person needs to be doing in a certain way, for example, how you boil an egg, like that matters, then we want to be pretty clear about that direction so that they can get a firm understanding of themselves in a way that works for them. We should always aim to say what we mean and not the opposite of what we mean. So please walk instead of don't run, because if what they hear is run, the don't is kind of unnecessary, like it's going to be irrelevant to them. I know I always struggle with that because I have to translate that in my head. Don't run means do what? Okay. We need to assess and address our own assumptions. It's very easy, particularly when we're in the fray of the school day and work and all of these things, to assume that a young person who was able to speak to me confidently yesterday should be able to speak to me confidently today. But that isn't how it works, because as we know, there's fluctuating capacity, right? And so the stressors on them today might be different, and also their communication needs are different, and today just might not be working for them. We want to make sure that we've made the intent clear. So for example, in activity B, if I had said to you at the beginning of that, we're going to draw a clown, it might have been a little bit easier to kind of know where to place things. But but we very rarely in life have the opportunity to be as clear as we would like to be. So that goes back to assessing our own assumptions. Like, did I actually give clear directions? Let me think about it. What did I say? Are they doing exactly what I told them to do? Then I don't really have a reason to be upset with them. I was unclear. Consider what other competing sensory inputs might be impacting capacity. So like what background noise that there is. So if your young person is in the living room and the TV is on, and in the kitchen they can hear the washing machine on the spin cycle, and also they have a younger sibling who is crying, and the light is really bright because the all the blinds are up, there's a lot going on for that young person that is maybe going to keep them from communicating with you as effectively or as directly as you would think that they could be doing. So we need to be considering what else is going on around them. We can use visual supports to support understanding, and this includes technology. So visual schedules, apps on phones, things like that. Most importantly, we want to be giving space, and we want to avoid assumptions and expectations about a child's understanding of nonverbal communication. So we might assume that they can look at my face and tell that from my face that I'm not happy, but that's an assumption. And I don't really have the right to make that assumption. I need to be working with that young person where they are and being direct and not like taking things personally that I think they should be getting because they're not in the same place I am. We want to be modeling language and vocabulary use with repetition. And there's the words up key messages approach that Highland has, and I'm going to share some resources with that about that later. We want to facilitate access to augmentative and alternative communication tools where appropriate. I'm going to talk about AAC a little bit more. And then particularly when we're thinking about body language and things like that, many neurodivergent young people find it a lot easier to have a conversation or to say something that's worrying them or bothering them if they're not having to look directly at somebody. So if we can position ourselves side by side, if it's in a walk, like taking a walk outside, or a drive in the car, if they're in the back seat and you're in the front, with the removal of that confrontational kind of somebody looking at me and expecting something, they can usually open up a little bit easier. And just a overall tip, only phrase questions as questions. So we don't want to be giving them the opportunity to say no, so do you want to get your shoes on? No. Please put your shoes on so that we can leave. That's a little bit more direct, right? It's telling them exactly what we need of them, and then they should hopefully be ready to go. Okay, so AAC, communication is more than spoken language. I always give this example, so forgive me if you've heard it before, but when my youngest son was small, he didn't speak until he was 4, but he had no trouble communicating with us. He communicated loads. He just didn't use verbal speech. So if he wanted peanut butter toast, he would go into the cupboard and take out the jar of peanut butter, the loaf of bread, smash them together, and throw them at me, right? He communicated brilliantly. I knew exactly what he wanted. It was maybe a little bit more destructive on the bread and the peanut butter and me than words would have been, but I knew what he needed and wanted. In less extreme ways, we can also be using AAC for communication that does not have to include verbal language. So there are many ways to do this. There's low-tech AAC, which includes aided language displays, communication boards, or high-tech with iPads and voice output type devices. There is a world of AAC out there, and we should be jumping on embracing that. If a young person wants to express themselves, we should be doing everything that we can to help them express themselves, because communication is a right, and access to it should not be denied. And what that means is if you're using a technology device for voice output, we can't take a technology device away if that's somebody's voice. So AAC is useful for anybody who needs it. It can be somebody who's situationally non-speaking. It can be somebody who's primarily non-speaking, or somebody who in this environment alone really struggles or struggles to process it when they're speaking it, but can type it a lot faster and have it read out, like that. We have to be open to all forms of communication because all of it is valid. Okay, so these are the resources I was talking about. Um, I'm going to send you all of these, except for the NeuroWild ones. The link is, I'll send you the link for it, but not the individual documents. But the words up attachments, or little graphics, and the modeling of AAC and all of that, I have electronic copies of that. So I'm going to attach that in the email that I send you when I send out the recording. So our key takeaways. Communication employs visual, vocal, and verbal language. That doesn't mean it has to be spoken. Neurodivergent brains have different communication norms, not disordered communication. Communication is a two-way street. It is not the responsibility of a neurodivergent person to change their communication style to meet the expectations of others. We must understand the differences in communication needs and experiences in order to support neurodivergent young people to express themselves. And support should always be affirming of the internal experience. And just don't forget there, we are using the wheel to gain perspective on a neurodivergent child's internal experience, not to force them to comply with predominant neurotype norms. Okay, so if you have any questions or you need any support, I have included there directly the speech and language therapy contact information because they told me that I could. So that's their phone number. You can call them. That's their email address if you want to speak with them directly. There is an AAC lead for the speech and language therapy team who I previously have worked with, and she's fabulous. So I can definitely say you will be safe with her. And of course, you can call Just Ask, or you can contact Thriving Families. Going to our website for resources is probably the most immediate way that you can get support from us right now, but you can always email and call also. So thank you very much for your attention.